sure we would have filled up. So, all right, Carmen, we are on. Welcome to our virtual quilt retreat here at Time Flies Quilt and Sew. I am Pam, the owner, and we are in Negaunee, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula. And you are?
I am in Spanish Fork, Utah, south of Salt Lake City, and welcome to my house. Notice I'm not in my sewing room.
Yeah. So we're gonna have a trunk show today with Ten Sisters. So we're excited to see what you have.
I am so excited to show you. So what I'm seeing on my camera here is myself.
Let me spotlight.
And so if we are
we are spotlighted, yes. So you will see yourself unless you change your view to gallery or something.
Well, and I think since I'm on my phone.
When you're on your phone, it's harder. You have to swipe and then you can't see. So
yeah, so don't hesitate to chime in and say, hey, move a little to the left, move a little to the right, come up closer so we can see. And so to me, I really want this to be interactive as much as possible. And because I love the questions and the good news about the trunk show today. For those of you that were in class yesterday and actually showed up again, that's always a super good sign. And so thank you. And so I'm anxious to hear how your process yesterday. But by way of an introduction, I am Carmen Geddes, and my company is Ten Sisters Handicraft. And I come from a big wacky family with 10 sisters in it and 7 brothers, and no twins, one mom and dad. And I'm number 12 out of the group. And so, this is, I was telling the girls yesterday, it's my favorite thing if we are gathering together, and especially with quilts. In fact, I teach at quite a few quilt retreats. I used to put some on myself, and I'd come home and I'd tell my husband, we had some awesome therapy sessions and we did get a little bit of quilting done. So anyways, but I love the idea of the virtual retreat also, because I feel like you've all come over, and what a easy, fun way for you all to come over and join me. And so, hey, Patrick, this is another thing I do when I'm doing this. I'm like yelling, would you go tell him I need 1 panel of any size of grid? And yeah, there might be probably one of my sewing super organized if you can't already.
Yeah.
But I was telling the girls yesterday that what really got me started in this whole process, I guess we'll back it up a little by way of introduction. I have been teaching quilting for many, many years. I've always described myself as a technique teacher, and I'm all about building the confidence. My philosophy is a finished quilt is the perfect quilt. Personally, I learned something with every quilt I make, and probably the one thing I've really learned more than anything else is I can live with an imperfect quilt. And I just, finished is good. And one time, after I got a long arm machine quite a few years ago, and I was down in my sewing room quilting away, and my husband Patrick and I kind of had this deal, because he loves to tease and he loves to scare. And so he would like sneak in and like, wah! And then I'm like, when I am machine quilting, you cannot scare me, because who knows where the machine will go. And so we had this thing, like, you have to announce yourself when you come into my sewing room, especially if I'm quilting. And so one time he walks in, he kind of made himself known. I stopped quilting. He doesn't say a word. He walks up to me in front of the quilting machine, quilting away. And he said, so what you would really like is to have a room that is filled with quilts. And I was like, yeah, I think so, pretty much. He's like, okay. He turns around and walks out of the sewing room. So I'm not sure if I love the process. I love the whole process of making quilts. And so I think I do. I just, we love to give them away. I mean, quilting is one of those amazing communities where most of what we do is for other people. Most of what we do is to give away in one way or another. And I think that's kind of cool. So anyway, and so I was kind of laughing because doing a trunk show from my house, I have so many quilts here. And I kept gathering more quilts and like, oh, I'll show them this one, I'll show them this one. So feel free to, just snooze, take a little nap. I'm going to try not to take all day with this trunk show. But the best news about this whole thing is every single quilt I'm showing you is made the exact same way. And so several years ago, we developed Easy Piecing Grid. And Easy Piecing Grid, and I don't know if you'll be able to see the printed grid on here. For those of you that were in class, have this in your hot little hands. But if you've never heard of Easy Piecing Grid, this is a lightweight iron-on foundation that we print a grid on. And so we actually print this grid in panels. And so this piece right here, this is pretty big. This is one panel of our 2-inch finished. So we label these by the finished size of the squares. And so I'm going to be showing you quilts with 2-inch finished all the way down to 1/2-inch finished. According to Patrick, that's for crazy people, but it's amazing how many people are making quilts with this tiny little 1-inch square. So like I said, we label these by the finished size. And this is nice and lightweight, but really strong. We actually pay extra for a product that you can't just get at the store. It's really nice and lightweight. This is going to stay in your quilt. I'm going to show you how we're putting these together. So because we're piecing on a foundation, we've kind of changed how we put these quilts together. Instead of thinking about block by block or strip piecing techniques, I'm going to show you the quilt. That's the one I'm demoing with. This is the quilt that started this whole thing. And so because we're piecing on the foundation, this is the mosaic quilt. This is in our 10 quilts for 10 sisters book. This is me and my sisters right here. I'm the one right here, second from the end, that looks like she thinks she knows everything. I do actually know. No, I'm kidding. So what we do is we take the whole quilt and then we just divide it up into sections. So you see, here's that mosaic, and it is divided up into sections, and each of these sections represent one of these panels. And because we piece in these different sizes, because we print in all these different sizes, we always tell you how big the quilt's going to be in the 1, 1.5, or 2-inch finished. We don't usually list the 1/2-inch finished, but I'll explain that. I'll explain that in a little bit. And so before I even demo, I want to show you this first quilt. And so I've got Patrick, my husband, and my amazing grandson, Grant, and this top quilt. And so I'm going to kind of stand over here to the side so you guys can see the quilt. Yeah, this mosaic right here on the top. And if you guys will stand right in front of the couch and so you can kind of see the whole thing. And so, I was really drawn to these quilts that were basically originally hand pieced, right? And so this is the mosaic. Now, when I show you the quilts, I'm going to tell you what size the finished square is and how many panels are in this quilt. And so this is actually a 20 panel project. This is the 1.5-inch finished. But when you look at this quilt, what you see are these on point set blocks, right? Well, you could strip piece those separate blocks, but these blocks are connected by this black chain that's a square. So there are no straight edges to sew, except if you dissected the quilt, horizontally and vertically. Oh, thanks, Patrick. And so this is one of these great old quilt patterns that traditionally was hand pieced, and that is what really motivated me to figure out a great way for everybody to make these quilts. And so, like I said, this is a 20 panel project. This is the 1.5 inch finished. And so awesome. So that's really the quilt that started the whole thing. And now what I love is all these amazing quilters, including total beginners, are making these quilts. And before I forget, I do want to mention one thing. And my friend Amy started a Facebook page called 10 Sisters Grid Quilters. So if you're on Facebook, go check out that group, because it's a great place to, people are showing projects they've done and ask questions if they have questions. And there's all sorts of easy piecers on that Facebook group that are just awesome. So now, because we print in different sizes, I'm going to show you the same quilt in a couple of different sizes. So the next quilt is the same quilt. It's the mosaic quilt, and it is 20 panels, but instead of 1.5 inch finished, this is the 1 inch finished. And you can come up a little bit closer. Only reason you're going to tell the size difference is I'm going to stand in front of it and you can see the. And so if you've ever wanted to try that true postage stamp quilt, it's just awesome. And so, for me, it was these old traditional patterns. Thank you, guys. That was really the motivation for me, were these old great traditional patterns. But really the sky is the limit. And so when I'm going to show you how we're going to put these quilts together, so you can like flop down for just
Hey, Carmen, can I ask you really quick? On that border of the second quilt, were those all tiny squares too?
no, on this second quilt, this is just a plain fabric border.
Okay, very good.
You know,
Cute.
that's interesting, because I actually, when I first came out with this, a friend of mine made the mosaic in the 1.5 inch finished, and she did this whole intricate border of the same pattern out of 1/2 inch finished. It's over the top.
Oh my gosh.
It's over the top. I can honestly say I don't think I'll ever do it, but it was amazing. So when you're making a quilt with easy piecing grid, you are essentially, the first thing you do is you decide what size you want, right? You want a little bit more quilt for your work, or you want to use pre-cuts like the jelly rolls or charm packs. You're going to go with the 2 inch finish, because that's the 2.5 inch square. And so usually you decide the first thing you decide is what size square. And then the other thing you're going to remember, if you don't remember anything else I say, is you're going to have that fusible side up. I always tell my students, you're only going to try to iron this to your ironing board one time. Ask me how I know that. And so you're going to have that fusible side up. And then you are going to, of course, cut out your squares. Yesterday in class, we were talking about the stripology ruler, which I love. That is what I use. I use the big one, the extra large, and I use the mini for when I'm cutting up all my little scraps into 1 and 1.5 inch squares. And some people like to use the die cutting machines, and so you're going to cut out your squares. Now, when you have that fusible side up, you're going to just find the section that you are working on if you are following a pattern, and then you just start laying out your squares. And so one of the things that I love, because we are piecing on this foundation, you can fussy cut fabrics, you can do some really fun designing with directional fabrics. But I think everybody's favorite part is that you get to see it. You get to see your quilt before you start to sew. In fact, I told the gals yesterday that I've been asked this several times. Somebody will come to class and they'll say, now, Carmen, is this going to be faster than traditional piecing? And I always tell them, it depends entirely on how decisive you are. Because sometimes somebody will take all day, not even kidding, on one panel, because they're just having so much fun auditioning different fabrics and colors. And then other people are coming and boom, they've got their whole quilt top ironed down in an all-day class. So after all these squares are where you want, then you're going to give it a good pressing. So these are really nice and secure. And then you just fold it on that fold line and sew your 1/4 inch seam. So no pins. and fold it on that fold line and sew your 1/4 inch seam. And you're going to do that all the way through the panel. Now, it doesn't matter if you're doing the short seams or the long seams first, but if you're piecing a quilt that has more than one panel, then you want to sew the same direction first on all the panels. Because when you start putting these panels together, those seams are going to be going the way that they're supposed to so that they all nest. Okay, so after you sew through that panel in one direction, this is the seam that you've just sewn. And you are going to take your nice Karen K. Buckley sharp little serrated scissors, and you're going to snip right between each of those squares right up to the stitch line. Now, even if you happen to snip through the stitching, everything is held together by the foundation, so it's not going to shift or move. But the reason we're doing that clip is so that you can press these seam allowances going in opposite direction each row. So see how this top row is going this way, and we're going to press this way and this way and this way. The other good news of the day is you actually don't need to remember anything that I'm saying, because I know Pam is probably going to be continuing to demo Easy Piecing Grid. And my website is tensisters.com. We've got some tutorial videos on there. It'll be like, wait, what did she say about that pressing? And so you're going to press those seam allowances going opposite directions so that when you do fold right sides together, look what happens. Those seams are just automatically nested perfectly. So there's no pinning, there's no adjusting. You're going to just sew your seams going in that opposite direction. And then this is how they're going to turn out. And so those intersections are perfect. Those corners, those points, whatever we want to call them, they are perfect every single time. And did I mention no pinning? And so the foundation is going to stay in your quilt. The second seam is just pressed in one direction. And so we did again talk about this yesterday, and it's something that I'm always reminding everybody is when you're pressing these seams, I highly recommend steam. We're going to bring in that moisture, and it's going to do a couple things. It's going to, when you're doing the gluing part, it's really going to help that fabric really stay nice and secure to the foundation. But when you're pressing your seams, it's going to keep those seams nice and flat, and it's going to keep this quilt top really nice and soft. And so then that is how we sew all of these quilts. Now we have different tips and things about how we sew the panels together. And so those are on the videos, and you know, and lots of good info out there. So, but don't hesitate for questions. But we're gonna get back to some more quilt. And so I want to show you. So now this next quilt just might be for crazy people. You have to kind of come up a little bit closer maybe on this. This is basically the mosaic. This is in the 1/2 inch finish, but what I did on this quilt is I just went all scrappy. I'm going to come up a little closer, Grant. So do you see how here's the black chain, and instead of just a single square in the center, I did a whole little plus, and then this is just all scraps. And so I kind of just couldn't stop ironing squares down with this, and it ended up being pretty big. Thank you. Thanks, Grant, for the 1/2 inch. Because the thing that's crazy about this 1/2 inch is you're starting with that great big 1 inch square, and then it literally shrinks in half with your seam allowances, 1/4 inch seam allowance on everything. It shrinks. So it's a little bit of a mind bender visually, because it just shrinks right in half. Okay, so the next quilt is going to be now, because I think everybody needs to make this pattern, this quilt. We did, yeah, there you go. This one we call Vintage Charm. It's the exact same pattern. I teach this class. You guys can back up a little bit just to kind of get a little bit more scale. And so this is a 6-panel project. And so 6, and in the 2 inch finish. So 6 panels of 2 inch finish make a really nice big throw. And so this pattern, you could actually just stop ironing squares in the big pattern, but we actually put a 6-panel project in our kids book, Quilts for Kids. And so this is in there in the 1 inch finished. It makes a darling table topper or wall hanging. but I wanted to show you this because when we first started doing 1/2 inch finished, this is that same quilt and the 1/2 inch finished. Isn't that nuts? Anyway, so I thought when this first came out, I thought, oh, I'm going to do pin cushions. I'm going to make, 1 or 2 projects, but it gets a little bit addictive. It's pretty darn fun. And so this, the 10 Sisters book is all squares. And so I think Pam was even saying yesterday, she suggests this one a lot. Just 4 of the quilts in this book were pictures of antique quilts. And this one is one of them. And so perfect, guys, kind of, there you go. And so this one is called Sweet Granny Squares. And if you guys come up a little bit closer, just a little bit more blendy, can you tell that I like chain quilts? But this was a picture of an antique quilt where it's got these bigger blocks and it's surrounded by chains with smaller blocks on the inside. I mean, I don't even know how we would go about trying to strip piece a quilt like this. And so this is one of my favorite patterns. And anyway, so one thing I will say is that I'm kind of rebelling that we have to name these quilts, but I realized we've got 4 books that we have finished. We're working on number 5. And so I have officially outlawed using Sweet or Granny or Scrappy. I'm trying to not use, because I'm saying these quilts and it's Sweet Granny Squares and Granny Scrappy Rose and Scrappy Garden. I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to stop using these words. And so, so the big one, that I've got these samples of the 1/2 inch finished from this first book because it's all squares, so just a little bit easier. So this is a big one, 2 inch finished. This is a 16 panel project. This is that very traditional trip around the world. And I kid you not, I literally had one square, this little black square that has this little fussy cut. And that's all I had of that fabric. But I want to show you the layout to this quilt. I call these layouts when we divide the quilts up into sections. And because essentially that's what we're doing. We're taking the quilt and just laying it out into sections. And so for this trip around the world, when I make this quilt, this is where I start piecing. I'm going to start on the panel that is the focal point of the whole quilt. And so visually, I think as quilters, we are very visual. I will always look at the pictures before I read any instructions. And so I love the fact that we can start at the focal point. And then if you don't want to make a quilt this big, you're just going to stop ironing squares. How are your arms back there, guys? If I don't want to make a quilt this big, I'm just going to stop ironing squares whenever I'm done. And so these layouts become really nice and versatile, which I love too. Good job. And then this one, this was the first sample I did in the 1/2 inch finish. And this is the same pattern of the trip around the world and just in solids. And this was just so fun. And I started right in the center. Now, all of the easy piecing panels are 9 by 14 squares. So the 1 inch finished is our smallest panel, and then 1.5. And then I showed you the 2 inch is our biggest. Well, when we decided to start printing 1/2 inch finished, I did not want to make a panel that was this big, right? And so instead of 9 by 14 squares, the 1/2 inch finished are 18 by 28, which equals 4 of the sections of any pattern. And so I think this took about, I think it was about 1.5, maybe it was 2. Anyway, it was just like a couple panels of that 1/2 inch finished versus, a whole bunch of panels. So anyway, 1/2 inch finished. I think that might be it for the 1/2 inch finished. Phew. And so then this one is of course, it's the scrappy chain. And so the one thing I wanted to point out about this is the layout in the book is way bigger than this quilt. This is 2 inch finished. Most all my quilts are scrappy, as you can see. And basically I was piecing this quilt and I ran out of this navy blue. And so this is how big the quilt is. And so, or if you know, you can kind of change the size and shape of a quilt just by where you're laying out your squares. And so this ended up a nice big square throw. This is still a quilt top. You guys want to flip it around and we'll just show them the back just out of curiosity. And so, you know, somebody said, now the back is as pretty as the front is. But the one point I want to make about when we're piecing with this is a lot of seams. This typically would be a very stretchy quilt top, you know, so much give to it because we're working with fabric. And but because we put it on that foundation, it is nice and stable. So I've talked to many long arm quilters besides myself. And it just does, they just don't shift and move like a typical quilt top would. The other thing I want to point out before I forget is when you make a quilt top, whether it's, you know, a 1-panel project or a 20-panel project, if you want to add a border, you just treat it like a regular quilt top. And I'll show you another quilt in a minute where we've got that. So you don't need to stabilize your border. So this is the last quilt I want to show you from, it's just from that book. And we call this the chevron. We actually, we self-publish our books, and this first book came out when chevrons were so popular. And so to me, this is sort of a faux Bargello quilt. And this is was just such a fun exercise in color play to me, you know, and just I think that's probably my least confident thing. That's why I go scrappy with most of my quilts. And so this was just really fun, you know, laying them out, experimenting what color was going to be touching the next one. And so this is really fun. And my youngest daughter, Maddie, golly, she had to have been about 15. No. She's probably 16 or 17. Anyway, had not done any piecing, and she did the sewing on this quilt. And so I'm over in my sewing room. I was probably quilting or something. And she's over there sewing this quilt. And she started saying, Mom, I'm doing it. Mom, I'm doing it. And finally I stopped and I'm like, what are you doing? And she opened it up and she was showing me her intersection. They're matching. All of these are matching up. She kept sewing a seam and then checking it. I'm doing it. So anyway, that was really fun memory, but you know, goes to show total beginner. Now I gotta say, we're gonna show, okay, we're gonna do some of the kids' quilts. And so our quilts for kids was just such a fun book to do. This one might be a little hard to see because this is very subtle. Can you see that's a little whale in there? And it was just really fun. So this is the 1-inch finished. And so on this quilt, the actual whale, the 6 panels of 1-inch finished stops. I just did a plain border, and then I did a little checkerboard border out of just some of the leftover scraps, and then added another little border after that. And so anyway, so fun. Sky's the limit. You know, I love borders. So this is our giraffe. I just want to show you one of the layouts of the quilt. Let's show you the giraffe here. And so all our little pixelated animals in this book are 6 panels. And let's see, back up and come this way. There we go. And then we just kind of threw in these fun little patchwork blocks over here. And so a couple fun things though about the whole concept of how we're piecing these quilts. One gal sent me a picture. Well, she made this giraffe for a little girl. So instead of the blocks over here, she did different sizes of little pixelated hearts. How fun is that? I got another picture from somebody. They were making this quilt for a big kid bed. And so they were using, this is the 1.5-inch finished. They were using 2-inch finish. So this is a bigger quilt. And they wanted it to be more of a twin size. So they made the neck and the legs longer. They just kept going. And so to me, I think that's my favorite part, is that you take the concept and then you just make it your own. And so this little fox was, inspiration for this little fox was from a cross stitch pattern. And so I like to call these, you know, little pixelated pictures. And so basically anything that is pixelated, anything that you can break down into a grid, you can piece. And I can't tell you how many quilters I have talked to that say, oh, I love pinwheel blocks, but I hate making pinwheel blocks because of the little twisty center that we've got to get nice and flat and getting those points to match. So we're going to talk about half square triangles, but this is 2-inch finished, and it's 1 panel, 2 panels, half a panel, half a panel. So 3 panels of 2-inch finish makes a really cute baby size quilt. And this has just got about a 3-inch plain border around the outside. So talking about half square triangles, before we show this next quilt, Patrick, I want to kind of talk about those, because I will tell you, for me personally, as a quilter, this was the biggest change for me. I had done, several patchwork. I call it patchwork, anything involving a half square triangle. I like to describe as patchwork, and strip piecing, and Eleanor Burns and some of the other great trailblazers in patchwork piecing just made the whole process, more fun and doable. But honestly, I spent a lot of time kind of backing up and going, yes, I can live with that. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's fine. Because I don't like to unpick, I think, is my thing. And so I just, it was getting those points to match up. And anyway, I didn't really love the process. So I didn't do a lot with patchwork until now. And so I want to show you in our, we're still on the kids book. I have one other quilt to show you in the kids book, but I just want to stop and talk about these half square triangles for just a minute. And so essentially, I'll explain this quilt I'm showing in a second, but essentially what we're doing with anything that involves a half square triangle, like a traditional quilt block, or like on our giraffe, parts of the giraffe have got half square triangles. We're just breaking everything down to squares and half square triangles. And so what you're going to do is pre-sew your half square triangle using your favorite technique, using your nice little block to get those half square triangles, right? And so you're going to just place them on the foundation, just like you do the regular squares. But the whole trick for getting great points every time is lining up the seam from corner to corner. And when you look at the foundation, every corner is defined by this extra little tick mark. So we're going to talk about half square triangles a little bit more, but Grant, let's show them right here. I think this is the top of it. You want to go that way. We got to back up because this is a pretty big quilt. And so this quilt, of course, is called Scrappy Garden Path. And this is the last quilt in the kids book. So the quilts in that book are not, we can walk a little forward now, Grant. These are not just baby quilts. No, this is 1-inch finished. And so we started with 1.5-inch squares. All right, good job. And I want to show you the layout, because I made the layout. Oh, we'll be all right. We can do it, you and I. So the layout, or you say you're going to trade with Zach? Yeah. Okay. They're tag teaming here. I want to show you the layout of this. So I actually made a big layout for this. This is a 24 panel layout. Well, guess what? In the quilt that we just showed you, I probably used about 40 panels because I wanted a big quilt out of little squares. And so the little squares aren't any harder to sew with, but it just takes more of them if you want to make a big quilt. And so that's kind of my favorite part about this concept, is that it's just so versatile. So I kept going with the design. Now my girlfriend made a gorgeous quilt out of this pattern, and she stopped somewhere in here. It was about a 10 panel, I believe, and she did the 1.5-inch finished out of her Christmas scraps, and it was gorgeous. So like I was saying on that other scrappy quilt, when you just stop ironing squares when this quilt is as big as you want it to be, or if you want it bigger, then you just keep going. So anyway, that's in the kids book, and I just love that. And so moving on to the half square triangles, I want to just show you To me, this is really fun because I've talked to so many quilters that say, you know, I started this block of the month, or I got this kit, and I got this pattern. You know, they'll bring them to class or they'll bring it over at a quilt show and say, can I make this quilt on your stuff? And if you can break it down into a grid, the answer is yes. And so, like I was saying, traditional patchwork was really the biggest change for me personally. And so the first quilt I want to show you is our big sampler. This is the Brothers book. And the first one I want to show you is the big sampler, which is the one with the red, white, and blue there. I got them a little bit out of order. Yeah, the big one. Nope, that big one right there. Yep. Yep, we're going to show them the big sample. We call it the big sampler. Seven Brothers sampler. You might have to kind of stand back a little bit. And so this quilt has got 30 different blocks in it. This one that they're showing you is the 2-inch finished. I go this way just a little bit. There you go. And what I'm going to show you the layout here. So this quilt is 12 panels of the 2-inch finished, and that's going to finish 72 by 84 inches before border. So, you know, you with borders are the best invention, right? Somebody said, how much do I need for a king size quilt? And I said, you know, you can make a king size quilt out of a 14-inch block if you add enough borders to it. And so, but what I want to show you on the layout is here's the quilt. Thank you guys. Here's the quilt that's got the 30 blocks in it, you know, telling you how big it is in the 1, 1.5, and 2-inch. We give you yardage for all the sizes. But here is the layout. So do you see how it's divided into sections that are the size of the panel? And then notice that the sashing and that first border are part of the piecing. And so even the sashing, we are breaking down into squares. Now, if you wanted to just make separate blocks, like if you were doing a block exchange or something, this is a great way to do it. And so now I want to show you this same quilt again. Zach, it's this one right here. And it's exactly the same quilt, but it's in 1.5-inch finished instead of 2-inch finished. And and you can come up a little bit closer and show them a little bit of detail. So this one I did in the Civil War fabrics. The other quilt had corner posts. This is just a straight sashing. And so how fun to audition all these fabrics. But I got to tell you, I think I'm more excited about how straight the sashing turns out than I am how the points turn out. Because sashing is kind of hard. I think it's kind of hard. But especially samplers where every block is different, to get to lay them out and audition those fabrics before, just so much fun. So much fun. And so some of them are some pretty intricate blocks. And so what we do, because we're breaking these blocks down to squares and half square triangles, the next page of the book, thanks you guys, we are giving you each individual block and telling you how many squares and half square triangles are in each of those blocks. And then we tell you how many squares to cut out for the sashing and the corner post. So it's just a different way to look at piecing, you know, endless quilts. And so when I was saying, if you've got a block of the month that you were, you know, you kind of got stuck on, or you've got some kit, you know, what I hope this does is I hope that it lets you look at quilts in a little bit different way, or looking at putting quilts together in just a little bit different way. And so one of my favorite comments that I hear when we're showing this at a quilt show is, I could do this. I could do that. I don't even quilt, but I could do that. And so the next quilt I'm going to show you is the small sampler. And so this sampler is a 6-panel project, but it's got 25 blocks in it. But you see how it's divided into 6 panels. And so then here are all the separate blocks for those. And so that's the quilt that I'm working on now. So you can, this is the 2-inch finished. And so you see that this is my 1 panel. And you see how we have broken these blocks down into squares and half square triangles. And what's really fun about some of these blocks is what we've done, with, I mean, even my corner posts are a directional fabric, and maybe a little bit of fussy cutting. And so one thing that I didn't bring up when we were first demoing this is that when you are laying your squares on this, you might notice that there is some wiggle room between your squares. Well, for me, the reason you see wiggle room on mine is because typically my cutting is not going to be perfect. But when we print this foundation, we purposely print the squares just slightly bigger than your cut size. And so basically what that means, it's about a 1/16 of an inch. So basically what that means is we are giving you room to fold. And so what that does is it eliminates that bulk in your seam allowance, and it gives you a much more lightweight and not bulky quilt top. And so for me to do this patchwork involving all these half square triangles and having the sewing be the easiest part of the whole thing, we're going to sew this exactly the same way. And so I've told them yesterday, we've taken the pinning out of patchwork, very, very little pinning. And so you're just going to sew this exactly the same way, where you fold that on the fold line and sew your seams and do your clipping and pressing and sew it the other direction. And then this is how it turns out. And so can you tell that I went overboard on all my patriotic fabrics? And so I've got this great big quilt. Now this is the 6-panel quilt, right? And this is basically, if you open this up, this is basically half of it that's all sewn up. Well, I'm demoing it once again. Notice how straight that sashing is, especially with some corner posts. But I am demoing with this quilt a lot. It's a nice size that shows a lot of the blocks. And so I thought, well, I'm not going to stop at 6 panels. And so this is going to be probably a king size quilt by the time I'm done. I'm just doing different variations of the same blocks, changing some of the fabrics around. And I'm just making it bigger. And so hope maybe for the next trunk show, I'll have this quilt done. Because I just I just keep going. And so we can show that quilt right here, this one. And I'm going to show you this same 6-panel, the block party sampler is what it is called. And let's see, I guess this is good right here. And so this is the 25 blocks. Again, this is the 2-inch finish. Now I have only made this quilt. And well, I did the big one in the 1.5, but I thought I need to do this in the 1-inch finish. So that's kind of on my next sample list. But this is the thing that's kind of fun about showing you the same quilt in these different fabrics is they look totally different. So on this quilt, we've got the quilt blocks, but the background of the blocks is the same. I used the same fabric for my sashing, and I just added this fun little funky color for the corner posts, right? So the blocks are kind of floating more in the background, and we've just accented with the corner posts. So totally different look than when you've got a really distinctive sashing showing. And so here's the next one. You guys can hold that up. Now this one is just a quilt top too. This is Zach. He's the other professional quilt holder. And so thank you.
I print your patterns.
That's right. He is our printer. None of this could happen without him. Trust me. And so here's the exact same quilt, but totally different. You got a very distinctive sashing here, no corner posts. The one thing I did want to show you on this one, and I'll just do it right here, is basically I've just added this nice wide border on this because I'm going to scallop the edges. So I did a nice wide border, but that border is not stabilized. It's just sewn on just like you would any other border. And you're just going to treat this just like a regular quilt top. All right. Awesome, guys. Thank you. Are you guys still with me? You still doing okay? I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah, we're doing good. We're enjoying it. We're oohing and eyeing back here.
I tell you, this is one of the funniest things to do. I'm just assuming you're out there, and I think that I'm really being entertaining and funny, but who knows?
Yeah, yeah. Only unless you've done it yourself, we can relate.
but what a great way for us. What a great way though, for us to be able to get together. So thank you.
It
And
really is. We can see your personality and we get a little peek into your real life.
right. Kids crying in the background, grandkids. So now I had a lot of requests for Irish chain. And so we put the triple Irish chain pattern in that brother's book. All the other quilts in the book have half square triangles, except this triple Irish chain. Now this is a smaller layout or a smaller quilt than the layout in the book. The layout in the book is huge. But once again, I, just stopped when I was done. And so this is just a really fun, perfect, perfect little bed quilt. This is the 2-inch finish, and this is probably about 8 panels that I did on this quilt. So thank you guys. Okay, one more quilt from that book is this one.
There is a template. One of the questions is, how do you scallop?
Oh, well,
That's another video.
yeah. Well, here's the deal on the scallops. If you haven't figured it out by now, basically everything that I do, my whole concept of teaching is if it looks hard, but it's actually really easy, then that's what I do. And that is the same for my scallops. And I, I teach that class fairly often. But when COVID first happened and all of our whole busy year of travel was canceled, I thought, oh my gosh, we got to get on Facebook and do some videos, and get out there and reach people. So the very first video that we did, and my camera was my phone, right? I demoed how to mark your quilt for wavy and scallop borders. And it's live, right? It was a Facebook live video. So I'm filming it live. And then after I'm done, of course, I'm looking at the video. My first reaction was, I need a new phone. The sound was bad. The picture was not great. And so that video is on the tutorials on tensisters.com. And I think it's just called Scalloped Borders. So forgive the sound, and forgive, all that. I will be redoing that video. Literally today, I'm getting my sewing room set up to start filming again. And we're going to redo that video. We got a bunch of other videos on the list to do. And because as you can see, this easy piecing grid is definitely something that needs to be shown. And then like I said at the beginning, as a technique teacher, there's just a lot of techniques that I want to have on video. So my whole machine binding class is available to watch. A few years ago, I filmed it for Riley Blake Fabrics. And so you can access it from my website. It's actually on their YouTube channel, but you can access my whole binding class, machine applique class. Is on the tutorials, and that scalloped one is just not a great video, but it kind of shows the concept, because I show you to do it with very little or no math. And so this quilt is called Northern Lights. No scrappy, no granny, no sweet. Patrick named this quilt. Now I can honestly tell you that this quilt I would never have tried. I honestly would have gone, whoa, I love that quilt. There's no way I'm going to make that, because tons of half square triangles. It's pretty intricate. This is what I call a 1-block quilt, right? This is one quilt block. But when you guys want to come forward just a little bit, but when you just repeat these blocks, well, you get this secondary design, which is one of the really fun things about quilt making. Is sometimes these great designs just kind of appear. And so this was a single block that we did in this, and you get this great secondary design of this Ohio star. But Patrick, if you'll come over this way so we can see the edge of the quilt, keep coming. Look at us doing technology. Okay, right here. And so originally, if we were doing just this 1-block quilt, it would end right here, right? The block ends right here. Well, because we pieced this on a foundation, I just extended the layout 2 more squares so that you get this Ohio star all along the edge. And then I just threw in this little flying geese unit, and it's just, of course, 2 half square triangles.
Flying goose if it's
It's a flying goose, flying geese, a triangle. We got a cute little accent of this triangle on the edge just because we can. And so thank you guys. And so one of the other quilts that so this is the layout for this Northern Light. This is 12 panels. That was the 2-inch finished. And so you can kind of see how we just extended that design out 2 more squares, and it gave you this really awesome edge to the quilt. And
Hey,
so
did you, Carmen, did you custom quilt that Northern Lights?
Yes.
Beautiful.
Oh,
Beautiful.
thank you. You know, my secret is just match the fabric with thread as best you can, and you cannot see any mistakes at all. So that's my secret for machine quilting. And so here's a really fun quilt in the book. And this one, we have a lot of 12 panel quilts in the Brothers book, which of course you can make smaller or bigger. And but notice that the checkerboard border is built right in to the piecing, so that when you're done sewing your panels together, you have a checkerboard border that's already on there. And so I think that is really fun. To me, you know, you can take a quilt and you think, oh, I'd like a cute little scrappy border, or I would like to do stars on the edge. You can just extend your layout and put that, as long as you're working with the same size squares, you can just put that right in the layout of your quilt, which to me sounds way easier and way more fun. And so the next thing I want to show you before I get to the last book is some of the patterns on the website. And so, oh, sorry, phone's ringing. People are leaving messages. Anyway, and so Zach, can you just hand me these one at a time? And so tensisters.com, we have over 80 patterns, and they are either free or 99 cents. But I'll tell you, we are #1 like business model, because we're super businessy people. One of our big priorities is to support the quilt shops, because we want them to stay. We want them to be here for us forever. And so we really encourage the quilt shops to use the patterns on our website to put together kits and classes for you guys. We did a really fun class yesterday with one of the quilts on the website called Sweetheart, and maybe during the retreat, hopefully they're going to do a little show and tell and see that. And so we started out the free patterns by I called it Project of the Month, and we started doing all these little projects. And so I'm really big into spools. I'm going to show you some of these. Now, this is a 1-panel project. This is a little scrap. We just call it the 1-panel spool. This is 2-inch finished. So this is pretty big. So if this was in the 1-inch finished, it's going to be like this big. So cute. This is just 1 panel project. And I think that is the 2-inch finished. That might be 1.5. I might have to get out my ruler. And we hand me that next one. Now this one, I think that is 2-inch. Yeah, this is 1.5. And so this is a 2-panel spool. Can you tell that I like 30s? Can you tell I'm a little junkie of 30s. And so this is a 2-panel spool. This is out of the 1.5-inch finished. And so this one is 1 panel, and this is called the Pumpkin Trio. And we did this a couple years ago. And then the next fall, I did the same pattern, but there are patchwork blocks inside the pumpkins. And that one is the Patchwork Pumpkin Trio. So this is 1 panel of the 2-inch finished. And so super fun. I have a little entry table. Thank you. I've got a little table in my entry that's just a small little table. So I made that in the 1-inch finished. And so it's just this perfect, cute little table runner for my little table. So they're not just little quilts. Yeah, you both might need to
Yeah, yeah.
hold that one up.
Stand up.
And so we have lots of pineapples on the website if you've been there. I love pineapples. This is the patriotic pineapple. I think the original pattern, I think this is the size, if I remember right. This is 1.5 inch finished. And so, you know, again, just fun and scrappy, and it's called the patriotic pineapple. This is in the 1.5 inch finished. We use one of the woven fabrics, you know, those Kaufman, the peppered cotton, some of those great woven fabrics. Thanks, guys. Where they fray like crazy, or when you press them, they curl. You know, I haven't talked about that a lot. But I've done some quilts using silk dupioni. We have a quilt going into our next book that is all men's suiting, lightweight suiting scraps. I'm super excited about that quilt. Anyway, and so this is called, what is this one called? Stars and Stripes. Thanks, Patrick. One thing, this is the 1.5 inch finish. This is a 6 panel. This is our only pattern that actually tells you that one panel makes one flag, and then you can add your own sashing. Well, I'm not going to do that. And so I just pieced the whole thing on the grid, including the sashing, but in the pattern because one flag is one panel. So I got to tell you, a gal made, in fact, I think we've got that quilt. So this is 6 panels of the 1.5 inch finish. And then this is the same quilt in the 1 inch finished. And isn't that fun? But I had a gal send me some pictures. She did placemats out of a single panel and a single flag. And she sent me the picture of her 4th of July table. And it was like something out of a magazine. It was so cute. And so we're actually going to do some free patterns that are specifically for placemats, because you can 1 inch finished. This is what this is. Makes a great placemat, but you can get 2 nice placemats out of a 2 inch finished panel. So we're going to do some fun patterns on just placemats. And then the next quilt, another block that I love are houses. I love house blocks. And oh, actually, let's wait on this quilt because I'm going to talk about it with that book. I thought that was a different, okay, pause on the houses. Another fun heart quilt that we did is this one, and we called it Candy Hearts or Conversation Hearts. I think we call it Candy Hearts. You know, again, very, very scrappy in the background. These were I had a little bundle of some little Tilda fabrics that were so sweet. And so that's what we put in this, and just a scrappy, fun, scrappy background. And then just some real easy, this kind of quilting you can pretty much do on your sewing machine. We just did straight lines going in different directions, a little bit of texture in the hearts. And so anyway, so that is one of the patterns on the website. And then this next pattern, some of you may have seen this quilt that came out last year. This is from Tilda's World, and this is called the Embroidery Flower Quilt. And I think that's upside down. Oh, never mind. Okay, back up a little bit further. Just because, you know, anything pixelated, it's like the further back that you stand, the better that you can see it. And, you know, I think every quilt reminds us of something. And this reminds me, my sister has a needlepoint purse that my grandmother made. And it's like, that's like the pattern on the front of the purse. Isn't that so cool? But this is the perfect example of a pixelated picture, right? Isn't that beautiful? And so I pieced mine in the 1 inch finished. It's a free download on tildasworld.com. You can email me, or I can send this info to Pam. The pattern calls for thanks, Patrick. The pattern calls for 2 inch cut squares for 1.5 inch finish. Well, I want to hang mine on my wall right over there. And so and plus I wanted the pixels to be smaller so you didn't have to stand back so far. And so I did that one in the 1 inch finished, and they are coming out with a new one in just a few weeks. I think it's called the Flower Pot. I think it's a vase with flowers, and I think they're calling it flower pot, but anyway, it's gorgeous. It takes 18 panels of easy piecing grid, of course, whatever size you want that to be. And I made a sizing chart that says all that. And so the other thing is, when you go to my website, if you sign up for my newsletter, we always put a free few patterns in every newsletter. And I try to, add info like this. My next newsletter is definitely gonna be talking about these quilts that from Tilda's Fabric. So, okay, the last thing that I want to talk to you about is our fourth book, because I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. So these first three books, the vast majority of the patterns on the website are designed for our regular easy piecing grid, 9 by 14 panels, right? Well, when we buy our product, it comes on these 60-inch wide rolls, and they cut the rolls for us to the size we need. And so what happened is we ended up with these 11 to 12-inch wide rolls, big rolls. And we thought, what are we going to do with this? And I thought, I know exactly what we're going to do with this. We are going to print border panels. And so we print these border panels that are these long, narrow panels. And all the panels are 36 squares long. So this panel right here is the 1.5-inch finished, because the 2-inch finish goes from here to the other end of my kitchen. It's like really long, 36 2.5-inch squares. So that one's going to finish at 72 inches long. Now, because we print on a roll that is short, the border panels do not have the same number of squares across. They all are 36 squares long, but the 2-inch finished have 4 squares across by 36. This is the 1.5-inch. It's got 5 squares across by 36, and the 1-inch finished has 6 squares across by 36 inches. Okay, so we had these for probably about 1.5 years, and they are awesome for borders and sashings. I will pull out a panel, and I'm making pot holders and all sorts of fun things. Creating fabric. We just came out with a new little bag pattern, a little zipper pouch. We will be adding that to the newsletter. I just finished the instructions for that, and we're using the border panels for those. So, but then it was like, you know what, there's some really great quilts that we can piece with these border panels. And if you're on to me, you know that from the beginning, I feel like I'm on a little bit of a mission to bring back some of these wonderful old quilt patterns that the vast majority of us wouldn't attempt, because they were either very, very tedious or tricky, or because they were hand pieced. And so we came out with our fourth book, and it is called Around the Block Quilts. And so all the quilts in this book are designed for the border panels. And so because the border panels do not have the same number of squares in each size, we had to kind of adapt how we're going to design this book. And so what we did in this book is we highlighted 3 different types of quilts. And the first quilts that we did are medallion quilts. And so we've got that second one down, you guys, is the medallion. Yeah. And oops, sorry, I lied. The next one down. So many quilts. And so the medallion quilt, I'll find the layout while they're grabbing that quilt. So this one is called the Next Door Neighbors Medallion. And so the thing that's so cool about medallion quilts is they start with a center block, and then you add borders, right? And so we have 2 medallion quilts. The first one is the one on the cover, and then we've got this one. And so what we did for the medallion quilts is we used all 3 sizes. So the center is 2-inch finished. The little houses and blocks, that border is 1-inch finished. This checkerboard is 1.5. This is 2-inch finished. This is 1-inch finished. This is 1.5-inch finished. And the outer border is 2-inch finished. And then you see that we've got some little framing borders throughout, you know, so that do we make sure that everything's going to fit to the next border. And so what's kind of fun is if you don't want to make a medallion this big, you know what I think would be fun is to do just the center out of like a holiday fabric and then just stop right there. So anyway, tons of fun possibilities with the medallion. And so what's a little different about the layout is we are still taking that quilt and dividing it into sections, but you see here's these border panels. And so the layout's a little bit different. So the second kind of quilt that we did with this is a row quilt. Now, my row quilts, I have lent out almost all of them, but I have a couple left here and it's the check that red background. So this, what we did with the row quilts in the back, in the book, is we designed a row quilt for the 1-inch finished. The reason we did that is because it's 6 squares down by 36 squares long, right? And then we have a couple little short rows that are just 3. So of course, we're going to just use half the panel. So this quilt is the 2-inch finished. And so each of these rows are finishing at 72 inches. So this is a big quilt. Now, you know, obviously you can stop. You don't have to make the whole thing. Then we've got these fun little connecting borders in between. So I want to show you that layout. So then here's the layout for the 2-inch finish. And so we give you extra rows in the book. And so this is just using 5 panels to make each of these row quilts. And but we give you a lot more than 5 rows as the idea in the book. Thank you guys. And I love sheep. We got a lot of sheep patterns. And then the next row quilt, that one with the cherries, that yellow. Yeah, the yellow one. That was the one we were going to pull out. So this quilt, what I did with this quilt is I took rows from the different sizes. I took some from the 1-inch, the 1.5, and the 2-inch finished. And I did this whole quilt in the 1.5-inch finished. Does that make sense? I used the 1.5, but so like this row right here has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, actually 6. I did these 2 backgrounds. So I've got seven squares this way by about the 36 squares long. And so what I did is I fused the panels together. And so I'm not going to demo the fusing, but we've got several videos. And this, so the concept is kind of like we're cutting and pasting. You know, we're cutting and pasting this foundation to make it as big or as small as we want it to be. And so it was just so much fun. So lots of little framing borders. And we did some fun little pinwheels. And this was just like, my sewing room was more like a mad scientist laboratory. And I wanted to name this quilt, I Will Never Use Up My Lori Holt Fabric Scraps. If any of you like her fabrics, I've been collecting. I want to show that one, a couple other rows. Sorry, you guys. Anyway, I'm never going to use those fabrics up. So if you lift it up so we can see this big row right down here. And so this is another example of where this whole row right here, that's a great big, this row is actually in the 2-inch finished, where instead of just 4 squares down, we've got 8 squares, but we did this great big fun. And I think it'd be fun to make a whole quilt out of this. I think this is really fun. Now the other row, I want you to show them if you'll kind of go, oops, the other way. So this row right here, and if you kind of come up a little bit closer, what you're going to notice about this row right here is this is on point. And so we, with our regular border panels, we also print an on point border panel. And so I'm going to show you that one next. We can do that yellow quilt that's on the bottom. And so this is also a row quilt, but it's pieced with the on point border panels. We did put this quilt in the book. It's the only quilt in the book that we are using the on point border panels. And this is the quilt. And so the package comes with 5 border panels, and the shops also carry it on the bolt. But this is the 2-inch finish, so each of these rows is 1 panel. And then if you guys come a little closer, the thing that is so fun, and I'm going to show you on the actual panel, but this, to me, this goes back to you're doing something that looks like it was really hard, but it is so easy. This is one of my favorite classes to teach because it's like instant gratification. Because I'll show you on the panel in a second, but you're going to piece this border panel, and then this in between is just a strip of fabric. And so, but you see on the outside of my panel, I'm using the same color as my fabric strip in the middle. So what you see on the finished quilt are these beautiful little picot edges. And people ask us all the time, how did you do that? Anyway, so isn't that so fun? And so I want to show you how that works on the actual panel. And so this is, it's a little bit hard to see when the squares are printed on because you cannot really see the printed panel. But what I want to point out is on the border, on the on point panels, because it's printed on point, it has to stop somewhere. And so do you see how the panel is stopped like over here? It's not covering this whole outside square. That makes sense? And so actually, I'm going to show you this end, because this one that has the same fabric, I'm actually going to use to make this strip wider. And there's instructions on that in the book. But this is the side I want to show you, because this is that quilt. Now this is the 1.5 inch finished, but because it is printed on the diagonal, basically, because it's printed on point, then you're going to put a full square around the outside, even though the panel might only just show a little bit of that outside square, right? Because the panel is cut straight. Now, the reason for that is when we are going to make this row quilt, you see, I need my background all across the top and down both sides, because this cream is my background fabric. Now, if there was any extra little panels sticking out, I've trimmed that off after I've ironed these down. And then when we sew, we're going to sew this the same way, but we start with 1 square, right? We're going to fold right sides together and sew that seam, and then go to the next one, right sides together, fold on that fold line, sew your 1/4 inch seam. So as you work through the panel, you see how you're kind of going at this diagonal, right? And you're going to put it in the machine this way, but as you fold it, so it looks a little weird, it feels a little bit weird, but we're still sewing just those straight seams, but you're folding this on the diagonal. So you're going to sew through the panel in one direction, clip and press your seams, and you're going to sew through it in the other direction. And then you're going to get this whole panel all sewn up. But the reason that we are putting a full square out here is after this is sewn up, we need seam allowance out here. Does that make sense? We need seam allowance out here so we don't cut off this point. I had a row all sewn up, but it's sewn into a quilt now. So that's what I'm doing with this project. But anyway, if you have a die cutting machine that will cut a triangle with seam allowance, you could use that. But otherwise, I just do a whole square, because then I know I'm going to have plenty of seam allowance when I trim this straight to add my straight seam. Anyway, so this is actually one of the next videos that I am working on. So pretty quickly, we should have a new video with the on point. These are really fun, so much fun. The last quilt that we did in this book is the, let me show you this one little wall hanging first. I forgot one of the patterns on the website. I had this sitting here. This is another cute little spool pattern, and I did it with 1 panel of the 1.5 inch border. I just did 1 row and then another row and did a little sashing. So anyway, I wanted to show this. So this is one of the patterns on the website, and we're using a border panel. So when you download a pattern, just double check that it's designed for regular easy piecing grid or the border panels, but there's just a couple with the borders. Now the Boston Commons is one of these wonderful, wonderful quilts. I'm going to show you the layout where that entire quilt is set on point. Let me get that straight. I'm not getting it straight. Hang on. There we go. Okay, stop moving, Carmen. Can you see that? And so that entire quilt is set on point. Now, again, this is one of these great old patterns that if you Google Boston Commons quilt, you're going to get these pictures of these cute little ladies sewing this quilt because it's all squares. It's a lot like a trip around the world where it starts with center squares instead of a single square, and then it is surrounded by rows of squares, but they're on point, right? And so I want to show you the layout. Now, the layout is with the border panels, but can you see how they are going diagonally? So when we make a quilt with for the Boston Commons, we're not using the on-point borders, right? If we use the on-point borders, we would have to fuse the whole quilt top together before we sewed, right? Because it has that picot edge. So we're going to use the regular easy piecing borders. So what I want you to see here, let me do it the other way, is that this is the center of my quilt. So do you see how I've chosen the center and then I'm starting to surround it with the colors? And the thing that is so cool about this process is we're choosing, basically you're choosing all of your fabrics for your quilt on your first panel, because it's a cross section of the whole quilt. So depending on how big the quilt is, of course, and so we're going to iron our squares on. We are going to just fold on the fold line, sew our seams. So we're going to sew this just like we do the regular grid, but when we sew these together, we're going to sew them together on the diagonal, just like you would any on point set quilt. So you're going to sew these panels together on the diagonal and your whole quilt is going to be set on point. And so we did 3 sizes of the Boston Commons, but then another quilt that we did, we call it Piccadilly Squares. It's the same Boston Commons concept, but it is separate blocks with the sashing. Now, this quilt might look kind of familiar to you guys, right? This is kind of a popular pattern that's out there, but what you're going to see is you're going to strip piece this block and then you cut the edges of the block straight and you add straight sashing, right? But what's so fun about this quilt is the sashing is on point. And so when people see this quilt, they're like, hey, wait a minute. They'll say, oh, I have that pattern. And then they're like, wait a minute. How did you get that sashing on point? So it's exactly the same concept. This is the panel. And so you're going to choose all your fabrics. And then when it's sewn, you're going to sew the panels together on the diagonal. We have a video on the Boston Commons quilt. We'll be doing some others. But to me, this is just a blast. I love making this pattern. I really want to do one in 1-inch finished in, my Civil War fabrics, because that would just be a great quilt. So the last quilt, you're almost done. You guys are doing amazing. The last quilt I'm going to show you today is our 1-inch finished Boston Commons. Now this, we did know how many squares are in this. I think it's a little bit over 5,000 squares in here. And if you if you look in the book, the people who pieced this quilt are Patrick and Zachary Geddes. I kid you not. I did the sewing, but they ironed all the squares. We had the panels on the island in my kitchen, and we did 2 panels, one right next to it. And as fast as I was cutting squares and directing them in the placement of the colors, we got this quilt done so fast. We pieced this quilt in, I think, like 2.5 days. It was crazy. So yeah, if you come up a little closer, it's just fun. When we first introduced this quilt, we were in Houston at the quilt show, and we were just laughing. I thought, if I had a nickel for every person that came up and said, where did you get this old antique quilt? And I was just giddy going, guess how we made this? We made this quilt. And so thank you guys. And so to me, this is another one of those great quilts that I feel like we are bringing back. Thank you, Zach. You know, where anybody can make this. And again, in those tiny little squares, that's why I like to show you the 2-inch finished, because that big quilt takes 30 panels of the 1-inch finished. Now, in contrast, about the same size quilt in the 2-inch finished takes, is it 15 panels? It's 15 of the border panels to make a quilt about the same size, a lot less squares, but 2.5-inch squares. So one of the patterns I'm just finishing up that's going to go on the website is a Boston Commons table topper. You know, so just a fun table topper, doing this Boston Commons. But anyway, and so, you know, I feel like I said, I'm kind of on a little bit of a crusade to bring back some of these great old quilts. But honestly, the biggest satisfaction that I get is my room is really filling up with quilts. No, no, really, my biggest satisfaction is seeing the confidence, seeing the quilts that people are making out there. And, you know, the last point I really want to make, though, you know, as I've shown you, you know, all these quilts that I've done, and I love the process. But to me, the most important thing to know as a quilter for all of us is that everything counts. I'll have people, you know, they'll look at some 1-inch finish and go, oh, you know, I only do, you know, strip quilts, or I only do, you know, and I'm like, it counts. You know, I only tie quilts. It totally counts. Everything we do counts. And I think all of you know that every quilt is just a little bit magic. And so we all have great quilt stories, and they all are just a little bit magic, and everything we do counts, and a finished quilt is the perfect quilt. So thank you so much for letting me show you these, and any questions out there. And so
Yeah, you probably can't see the questions, so I'll read some of them. But one of the questions from Nancy was, she's sewing with 2 of her friends, and she said, a few of us are getting the fusible sticky stuff on our irons when pressing down the tip or pressing down the squares. Any tips for us? And I guess my first question is, are they leaving the borders on the fusible?
Right. That's typically the most common is, you know, when you're ironing squares, we just kind of forget what's fusible, or we've got some over on the edges. We were talking about this yesterday in class. First of all, to address when it actually gets on your iron, because if any of us have done anything with fusible anything, at some point, we're probably going to get this on our iron a little bit, no matter how careful we are. And so Mr. Clean Magic Eraser works awesome. I get a dish towel and I put the magic eraser on the dish towel and I squirt it with water, and I just rub my hot iron over the top of that. It doesn't melt or fume. It's a great iron cleaner. There's probably some other good ones out there. I use the magic eraser, works great. In fact, I was teaching a class years ago, and it was actually on machine applique, and we were using travel size iron, and I was showing them in this classroom how to clean the irons. And we had people coming in from other classrooms saying, I heard you're cleaning irons in this class. Anyway, but you can use an applique pressing sheet or parchment paper. In fact, Pam was telling me, and I don't remember the name of the sheet you were using, but it's the one that you can see through. And you can iron.
The Fusion View. The Fusion View mat is
Yes.
what I used on my Laura Star, because the Laura Stars are an expensive iron. But you know, and I did it long enough so it would get hot enough so it did melt. So that's an option too. And we've got different sizes.
Yes. One thing we were talking about too, though, if you want to use an applique pressing sheet or parchment paper, because when I am ironing and pressing my squares, I really like to bring in that moisture. I really like using steam. And so if you use an applique pressing sheet, You don't want, you do like a little mist bottle of water, and then you can put your applique pressing sheet over the top of that, and it's going to generate some steam. And
Yeah.
so I hope that helps with the fusible. But generally speaking, when your squares are here and your foundation's here, I'm not really getting anything on my iron. And so, but if we get over on the edge a little bit, then you will. So few different options, you know, we all kind of have our own process, but bring in a little bit of steam or moisture whenever you can.
Yeah, and then I think Diane was asking about the pattern in the fabric. I think what she's asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, is she'd like to have us make some kits.
Right. Good suggestion. More work for the quilt shop. No. Well, you know, I tell you, one of the biggest changes, in my opinion, in the quilting world was when the fabric companies started making a fabric line. When I first was into sewing and quilting, they didn't do fabric lines. They just made all this fabric, you know, and you'd have to, that was a quilter's biggest dilemma, was how do I choose the fabrics for this quilt? And then they came out with these fabric lines, and now we have these designers. I have a line of fabric that I have probably had for at least 5 years or more. And I have I got a couple of jelly rolls, and I got a bunch of charm packs, and I have some yardage, and I haven't done anything with it. Well, the same designer just came out with a new line. It's all the same colors. It totally coordinates. I'm like, sweet, now I got to get some more of that fabric so I can make even a bigger quilt. Anyway, I just think that, you know, so a lot of people will say, what line of fabric did you use in that? And a lot of times it's from my stash, but I'm like the fabric mashup queen. I don't follow instructions well. I don't even follow my instructions well. So I'm always going, well, let's see, how can I branch out here? You know, how can I grab some other colors? And anyway, but sometimes you can find something really similar. You know, I like to look at the quilt as having a personality. You know, is this like bright and cheery? Is this whimsical? Is this more, you know, soft? And, you know, is this gonna, I want this to look really super modern. To me, if you can figure out kind of, you know, what's this quilt for? You know, a little bit, what's the personality of this quilt? That really helps me in choosing the fabric. So anyway.
I also have one of these that you sent us. This is the piping tool.
Yes.
If you want to talk about that.
If you go look at the pink demo bag, it might be on the floor by my sewing table. I've got a little demo in there. And so let me grab a quilt here. That, you know, a lot. Can you see that black piping in that one?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And so it's so funny because a few years ago, somebody came up to me and said, Carmen, piping is your trademark. And I was like, what? And I was like, oh, I put it in a lot of my quilts. And so I love adding piping to the edge of my quilt before I bind it for several reasons. And so I'm going to grab one more. And so I do a regular piping with the cord. I'm not doing just, oh, thank you, that's perfect. I don't do, you know, just like a folded flange of fabric for a couple of reasons. We're going to make the piping. Now you could buy the store-bought piping, you know, and trim it down if you want to. But it's really easy to make your own piping. We've got a couple of videos on it in my class. That's in the tutorials. That's the machine binding class. It's all in chapters, and there's a whole chapter just talking about piping, making it, adding it to the quilt. But I use this little nylon cord that is, you're going to find it like in the by the rope at Ace Hardware. And there's like, you'll get like a cone. Sometimes you can find it in the home deck section. But it's usually super, super tiny. The cording that you'll find in the home deck a lot of times is like for like making Roman shade blinds. So, and essentially we are making mini piping, because when you talk about piping, yeah, you got home deck piping, but essentially we're making more of a mini piping is how I kind of look at it. So you're using the nylon cord. I am going to cut a strip of fabric. I use about 1.5 inch wide strip. Does not need to be on the bias. In fact, I prefer it when it's not. If I have yardage that I know I want to use some of it for piping, I will cut along the selvage edge, not including the selvage necessarily, but that lengthwise grain is very tight. Because to me, what the piping does, besides giving you this really great, great little edge and a really nice little pop of color, because we're making the piping with the cord, I'm going to have this really nice, stable edge to my quilt. I mean, have you ever finished making a quilt and you bound that quilt and then you hang it up at the quilt show and go, why is the edge of the quilt waving? I know my quilt was square, and why is it? It's really easy to stretch the quilt or to stretch the binding. And so that is another reason I love putting piping on the edge before I bind it, because this nylon cord is not going to shrink. It's not going to stretch. I'm all about 100% cotton, but when I add piping, I'm using that nylon cord. So you're going to use your zipper foot of your sewing machine, because the zipper foot is going to butt up against the cord, and then you're going to move your needle over. So it's kind of a fun little practice. Lengthen your stitch length and make your piping. If I'm making a big long piece of piping, I'm just going to sew these strips together end to end. I do not sew them on the diagonal like you would binding strips, because you're never going to find that seam in your piping, because it's such a tiny little thing. And so this is where the piping tool comes in, because if I want to add piping to my quilt before I bind it, let's back up to when we bind the quilt. Typically, when we're binding the quilt, we're going to sew that binding on the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, right? So if I want piping on the quilt before I bind it, I need piping with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I tried this about, oh gosh, it's been like 35 years ago or more. I took a class with my sister and we made piping, and it was like magic. It was so fun to make this pretty little piping. And then the teacher said, okay, now we're going to take our ruler and lay it over that cord, lay it over the piping and cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I was like, well, forget that. There's no way, because it was like rolling and moving and I'm trying to cut. And it was like, meh. Well, years later, part of my education was I got to be an educator for Viking and FAP sewing machines for about 13 or 14 years. And I told them yesterday in class, I learned way more than I taught. There was it was like Christmas. As an educator, they would send me boxes of like patterns and tools and projects. And so for the first few months, I was like, this is the best job in the world. And then I realized I have to make all this stuff and I have to teach people how to use it. I'm like, this is the worst job. No, but I was sent a piping tool, and it was called the Piping Hot Binding Tool, and it was awesome. And the piping tool is like an acrylic ruler, but instead of just a line, there is a groove in the back. Well, this Piping Hot Binding Tool had 2 seam allowances, had a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and it had a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Well, I wanted a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I made my own, and I wanted a 5/8 inch seam allowance for garment sewing. So we made our own. This is the Ten Sisters piping tool. It has 4 seam allowances in it. We sell this piping tool mostly to heirloom sewers, because they do a lot of mini piping and they typically are using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Well, for quilting, I'm going to use the 1/4 inch seam allowance, right? And so I am going to take my piping that I made, against my chest is my cutting mat here. And so I'm going to take my piping that I made and I'm going to find the 1/4 inch line on the ruler. Remember, it has a groove underneath. And so then I'm going to, let's see if I can do this. I'm going to put the groove right over the cord, right? So it's going to fit right inside that groove. And then I'm just going to, with my rotary cutter, I'm just going to cut off the excess. And basically what that's going to do is it's going to give me piping with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so then I'm going to just sew that right to the edge of my quilt. I'm going to overlap my corners. Unless it's scalloped or wavy or a round corner, I'm just going to overlap and I'm going to sew that to the quilt. And then I'm going to sew the binding on the quilt. I sew my binding on the front. And then after you wrap that around, then you've got this great little pop color and a really nice stable. So in the videos, I talk about adding piping to wavy and scallop borders a little bit. We talk about all the techniques for using that piping tool, but it's just it's like any other tool. When I first started sewing and being introduced to different sewing machine feet, they were like magic. It's like, oh my God, even a 1/4 inch piecing foot was like changed my world when those first came out. And so the piping tool is just, to me, it's just another great tool to do something that looks like it was really hard, but it was really easy.
So Carmen.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're sewing the piping onto the front of the quilt
Yes.
and then sewing the binding onto the front of the quilt and turning it to the back to hand sew it.
Well, that's in the class, because here's the deal. For years, when I was teaching this class, I would say, okay, we're going to sew the piping onto the front of the quilt, right? Well, I'm sewing my binding on the front of the quilt and then wrapping it around. So I was just telling my students, okay, just lay your binding on top and trust your 1/4 inch seam allowance and just sew your binding on, and this is what you're going to get. Well, I was freaking them out. They're like, wait, you want us to cover it up and what? And so now what I teach is, if we back up to when we sew the piping to the edge of the quilt, I put a contrasting thread in my bobbin. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be bright orange on white, but something that you can see. This is when I'm sewing the piping on the front of the quilt. Now, we make the piping with a zipper foot, but when you sew it on the quilt, I use your regular, not even a 1/4 inch piecing foot. I use that regular basic wide foot because it keeps all the piping stable. And then I'm just going to sew right next to that cord, sew it on the quilt. I've got a contrasting thread in the bobbin. I'm still putting my binding. Let me do it this way. I'm still putting my binding on the front of the quilt, but I turn the quilt over and I'm sewing it from the back side, because all I'm doing is following this seam line that I sewed the piping on the quilt with, if that makes sense. And I know it's a 1/4 inch away from the edge because my piping has a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so the thing that I love is that, you know how when we are going to miter the corner, we stop a 1/4 inch away from the edge? Well, when I sewed the piping on, it marks that exact spot where I need to stop to miter the corner.
Okay.
So the only thing is, it feels weird for like the first 2 corners because we're mitering exactly the same way, but we are moving in a counterclockwise direction around the quilt. So left-handed people are saying, thank you, you're finally doing this right. And so now, because I put piping on so many of my projects, if I am binding a quilt without piping and I'm mitering, I'm going in that clockwise direction, I'm like, wait, how do I do this again? Because I'm so used to going the other direction, because you're doing it the same, but you're just sewing from the back of the quilt and following that line. And so it just helps you be really precise. But again, it's just like that.
So you're not hand stitching, you are using your machine on the backside.
Well, and this is something I talk about in the class, because when you talk about binding the quilt, some people love hand binding a quilt down. You know, this has probably been about 15 years ago, one of the first Houston quilt shows I got to go to as an educator. The quilt that won Best in Show, the binding was machine sewn down. And I was
Yeah,
like,
because
I was
we are machine binding people
Yeah.
over here.
Well, you know, and some people love the process. So we back up to the question of, when you're going to bind a quilt, that's what you ask yourself. It's like, am I going to, I'm going to sew the binding on the quilt initially with my sewing machine, right? But after it's sewn on, am I going to hand sew it down, or am I going to machine sew it down? Now, and so then what that question does for you is it helps you decide how wide you're cutting your binding strip. That is the question, because if, you know, we're not putting our quilts into shows to be judged, but we sort of use those guidelines as a standard of, you know, what makes a good binding, or what do judges look for, you know, which is totally subjective. But basically, if your quilt was being judged, a judge would look for a quilt that would binding, rather, back up. If a judge was looking at your quilt, they would be looking for a binding that is full of quilt, right? They're going to come along and they're going to pinch that binding, and they're going to see if it's filled with quilt. And so if you want to hand sew your binding down, and we're assuming we're sewing the binding on the front of the quilt, when you wrap it around to the back of the quilt, you want that folded edge to land right on top of the seam that you sewed the binding on with, because that means your binding is full of quilt, right? If you just randomly cut 2.5-inch strips, well, now we have to back up to, what is your typical quilt sandwich? You know, the quilt sandwich is the quilt top, the batting, and the backing. So 99% of my quilts are cotton top. Most of my quilts I have added a little extra border to, not all, but most of them. And so it's cotton on the top. 99% of my quilts, I'm using a thin batting. I'm using a 80-20, I'm using 100% cotton, or I'm using bamboo, which, if any of you have not tried bamboo, it's more pricey, but it is really yummy batting. But I'm using a thinner bat on my quilts. And then I am typically using cotton on the back. So that's my typical quilt sandwich, right? My top, a thinner batting. And so before I go ahead and cut my strips for my binding, I am going to take probably a 2.5-inch square, works really great. And we all have them. And I fold it in half and I press it just like I would a binding. And I take it to the edge of my quilt. Now this is with or without piping. This is just a binding tip. I take it to the edge of my quilt. I'm going to have that edge of the quilt all nice and cleaned up and ready to bind. And I'm going to sew that little strip to my quilt. Don't just pin it. You can use a basting, a little bit longer stitch length, maybe not a true big long baste, because that's going to pucker it up, but just sew it to your quilt with the seam allowance that you want to sew the binding on with, and then wrap it around and see where it lands. If you want to hand sew it down and your fold is going like a 1/4 of an inch past your stitch line, well, that's not going to work if you want that binding to be full of quilt. So then you take off that little square. It's already pressed in half, and you're going to shave off not even 1/8 of an inch. It's so weird because it's doubled. You're just going to shave off a few threads and you sew it back onto your quilt. And so what you're going to find is what width of binding strip you're going to cut for your typical quilt sandwich, right? And I am not a 2 3/8 inch person, but my perfect width of binding. I do a nice full 1/4 inch. I've got my typical quilt sandwich. Well, I'm machine sewing that binding down. And so when I fold my binding back around the edge of the quilt, I want that folded edge of my binding to go about 1/8 of an inch past my stitching. And what I do, just in a nutshell, is I use the liquid basting glue, and I do a little bead of that glue and I heat set my binding in place with a hot dry iron. It's basically a starch-based glue. We're kind of over starching that. I have used a glue pen or a glue stick in a pinch, but the liquid glue, I mean, I swear I've got quilts that I have had glued down for years that are not so. I mean, it holds really, really well. And then I actually sew my binding from the top. I do invisible thread in the top. I match my binding in the bobbin. I use the stitch in the ditch foot that has a guide down the center, not the guide on the side, but the guide down the center. And if I am binding, if I have piping, the guide goes between the piping and the binding. If there's no piping, it's just between, right on the edge of the binding next to the quilt with that little that little guide just kind of opens that little space up. And I lengthen my stitch length. I just do invisible thread. And I do a nice little stitch when I get to the corner, I just pivot and I go down. Because I have glued my binding down in the back, that miter rather, because I've glued that miter down in the back, that's not going to go anywhere, and that's going to totally catch in my seam. And then you're good. In fact, this project is just glued. It's not sewn down yet. I know, I'm so bad. I'm actually doing way better at actually sewing my bindings down. I hung a quilt in a little local show. They said, "Oh, we need some more quilts. Can we come and pick up some quilts from you?" I was like, "Sure." And I handed the lady, 5 or 6 quilts, and the quilts were being judged. I had no idea. And one of my quilts won a prize. This was like 15 years ago. And one of my quilts got a prize. I think I got $15. And so there's these judges' notes that I get. And the judges' notes, they said, "Beautiful stitching on your binding. We could not even see your invisible stitches." It was totally glued down. I won that by deception anyway. So a lot more tips and a lot more things that go into machine binding techniques. And so, like I said, the whole class is on tensisters.com, and it is in chapters, so you can skip through it. And but I will tell you, if you have not figured it out by now, I have kind of this magic voice that can put you right to sleep. So if you had a nap through this trunk show, it happens all the time.
Well, all we have to do is have Connie talk a little bit. She'll wake everybody up.
I know. It's like, "Hey, time to wake up. She's done talking."
Oh, we were laughing really hard about your binding with the glue. That's hilarious.
Oh my gosh, I'm not even kidding you. I saved that note for years. I think I lost it when we moved. But it was just like, "Oh, beautiful job on your invisible stitching." And I was like, "Oh my gosh."
I have a quilt on my shop walls too, and the binding is just glued.
I know. I always tease and I say, if it's a table runner or a wall hanging, you're done. Until you wash it. But it's happened several times. I've had a sample hanging up in class, and these 2 gals one time, "Carmen, we cannot even see the stitching on your binding." And I came over and went rip, 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 and opened up the glue down. They were like, "Oh my gosh." So I am doing a lot better after that kind of traumatized me. So I am doing better about actually. In fact, when we get ready to go to a show, or I send a lot of quilts out to shops now for trunk shows for them to borrow. And Patrick always says, "Now, are your bindings sewn down?" He asks me every time, "Are your bindings sewn down on these quilts?" I'm like, "Oh, I better double check and make sure." So
Well,
anyway,
that's cool. I think what I'll do, because I don't have your piping tool online yet on my shop, but what I'll do is I'll put some on, because I think it's a cool tool. That's why I didn't know how it works. So thank you
Yeah.
for your demonstration on it.
Yeah.
And what I'll do is I'll put like 100 on there, or even number. And
Yeah.
that way people can purchase them online. If you've already placed your order, just go ahead and place
Perfect.
another order just for this piping ruler if you'd like.
Yeah.
And
It's a great
then
tool.
we'll know how many we need to order, and we'll order a few extra for the shop. And
Perfect.
then we can send these to you or let you know when they come in. So
That's
yes,
perfect.
all
Well,
of the
you know,
marketing
Well,
are
and
here.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I did tell the gals yesterday, because we are so new, we sell retail on our website, and I do go to some quilt shows. I come to, different guilds and things to teach. But because we sell wholesale to your quilt shops, we don't ever discount. Um, when people come to a booth and say, so what's the show special? And I always tell them, well, the special is I came and brought all my stuff, so you can go tell your local quilt shop to carry this. Because I think that you have a great sale for all your retreaters on the website. So,
Yeah,
we
do.
really encourage you to support your shop and buy, but come and get a bunch of patterns on our website and watch our videos. And so, yeah, we're just really excited to get to share and show this.
Yeah,
My
well, that's great. One thing I was going to ask you, I have the ability to create links and make downloadable patterns on
Yeah.
my website too. Would you
Yes.
have a problem if I linked some of your patterns and call them 10 Sisters, give you all the credit in that, where people can go right from my website, or do you want them to go to yours?
Actually, I'm totally fine with that. The only thing is sometimes they change from free to a cost.
Oh,
And so maybe just double check on that.
okay.
But we really want to make them available to the
Yeah,
shop, as
yeah.
much as we possibly can. We just ask that you kind of leave them as they are. You
Oh,
also,
yeah.
you can download the easy piecing instruction pages we have an on point instruction page, regular instruction page. And, those you can download for kits and things, but I don't have a problem with that. The only thing we would double check is maybe if now it's like, okay, now these are 99 cents and, instead of,
Okay. Okay,
so
yeah.
so that's the only thing, but we try to keep we will keep free forever.
Okay.
If I ever do anything, like we have Mario and Minecraft, and we have some Star Wars, and my grandkids have a whole stack of other ones for me to make into patterns. Anything that is like a licensed product, they're always free. Those are always going to be free. And but the thing is, there's just endless possibilities. So we're just always coming up with some new patterns. And then like I'm working after this next book, the book after that's a Christmas book. So some of those Christmas patterns may come off the website because they will be in or part of quilts in the book. So you got to be quick and to get these free patterns. But yeah, let's chat about that, because I think any way we can make them available to your customers, great.
Good. Well, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really, really fun. Does anybody else have any questions for Carmen? But I would say this has been wonderful. I really appreciate all of the quilts that you showed. So thank your quilt holders for us.
Like a rotating team of quilt holders.
Yeah, that's just awesome. Well, nice to meet you, and I hope I see you in person sometime down the road too.
I hope so too. And you guys continue, have a great day of retreating, and thanks for joining me at my house. That was the best.
Sounds good.
All right. You guys take care.
Yeah. What is the retail of your piping tool?
Oh, it's $19.99.
Okay,
Yeah.
sounds
And
good.
there's a instruction page right in the little package that has some pictures. And
we
so
got it
yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay. All right.
Thank
Happy
you,
Halloween,
Carmen.
everybody. Okay, take care.
Bye. I'll let you leave. We're staying.
Oh, yeah, you guys know. All right, see you later.